Hello, this is Chuck Stevens, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 17th issue of the New York Times here on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the front page, the attack on Jewish celebration in Sydney was motivated by an Islamic State ideology, Australia's Prime Minister said on Tuesday, as the authorities investigated whether a visit to the southern Philippines last month by the two suspected gunmen had any connection to the mass shooting. The police found two homemade Islamic State flags in the car that the suspects, a 50-year-old man and his 24-year-old son, drove to the site of the massacre on Sunday, investigators said. The authorities also recovered improvised explosive devices in the car. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the two men appeared to be acting alone and described the shooting as a meticulous, calculated, cold-blooded attack. It would appear that this was motivated by Islamic State ideology, he said on Monday. Mr. Albanese said there was no evidence that the gunmen were part of a cell. The attack on the Hanukkah celebration was Australia's worst mass shooting in 3 decades, killing 15 people and wounding dozens. It has led to debates and recriminations about whether the country has been vigilant enough about extremism and anti-Semitism in particular. Officials in Australia and India released more information on Tuesday about the gunman. The older gunman, Shahid Akram, was an Indian citizen from Hyderabad in southern India who moved to Australia in 1998 in search of a job, according to a statement released on Tuesday by the police in the southern Indian state of Telangana. The statement said that he had married in Australia, where he had 2 children who are Australian citizens, a son, Naveed, and a daughter. Akram was shot and killed by the police at the scene of the shooting. Naveed Akram was injured. Shahid Akram's relatives in India told the police that he had rarely been in touch with them, visiting 6 times since his departure. The statement said, adding that Mr. Akram did not have a criminal record. Australian officials said the reasons for a nearly month-long trip by the father and son to the southern Philippines last month were being investigated. Philippine authorities have battled Islamic militant groups for decades in the country's southernmost islands, including some with ties to the Islamic State. The Philippine Bureau of Investigation said the men arrived in the country together on November 1st, reporting their final destination as Davao, a city considered the gateway to the south of the country. The 2 men left the country on November 28th. Australian officials previously said that Naveed Akram had come to the authorities' attention in 2019, but that it was determined he did not pose an immediate threat. His father was also interviewed at the time, officials said. The Australian news media has reported, citing unnamed police sources, that the 2019 investigation was over Naveed Akram's links to Isaac al-Matari, a self-proclaimed Islamic State commander based in Sydney who was convicted of plotting a terrorist attack. Mr. al-Matari was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 2021. The shooting occurred despite Australia's relatively strict gun control laws, many of which were enacted after a 1996 massacre that killed 35 people. Even so, Shahid Akram was a licensed holder of 6 firearms that were registered to him legally according to the authorities. Australian leaders are now discussing whether they need even stricter gun laws. Among the proposals under consideration, according to the Prime Minister's office, is the use of criminal intelligence in the process of evaluating gun license applications. Those killed in Sunday's attack ranged in the age from 10 to 87. They included Alex Claytaman, a Holocaust survivor, who was attending the event with his 2 children and 11 grandchildren, and who died shielding his wife, according to Chabad, a global Jewish organization with a presence in Sydney. Wow. Eli Schlanger, a long-serving rabbi of the Jewish community in Sydney, was among the dead, as was Dan Elkaman, a French citizen celebrating Hanukkah in Australia. Peter Megger, a retired police officer and freelance photographer, was killed. The youngest victim was a girl named Matilda. A short but dramatic video emerged on Tuesday of a couple that tried to stop one of the gunmen. Boris and Sophia Gurman were on Campbell Parade, a road near Bondi Beach, when Sajid Akram, the older gunman, emerged from a silver car parked close to a footbridge leading to the beach. One of the ISIS flags could be seen on the windshield. The couple confronted Mr. Akram, according to dashcam footage of the moment that was captured by a passing car and verified by the New York Times. Mr. Gurman, age 69, grappled with Mr. Akram, wrestling what appears to be a firearm from him, and knocking him to the ground. With his wife beside him, Mr. Gurman then faced off with Mr. Akram as bystanders took shelter at a nearby bus stop. The attempt to disarm the gunman was similar to the intervention by Ahmad El Ahmad, a bystander, who tackled Mr. Akram, an act of bravery also captured on video, which was widely circulated after the massacre. Mr. El Ahmad, who was injured, was waiting on Tuesday to undergo surgery. The Gurmans, however, were killed. The exact circumstances of their death were not clear, but later video showed a man and woman lying motionless on the ground. Mr. Gurman was a retired mechanic, and Ms. Gurman worked for the Australian Postal Service, according to a statement from the family published in the Australian news media. They were of Russian Jewish heritage, according to the Australian news media. They were the heart of our family, the statement said, adding that the video showed them courageously attempting to disarm an attacker in an effort to protect others. While nothing can lessen the pain of losing Boris and Sophia, we feel an overwhelming sense of pride in their bravery and selflessness, the statement said. Even though the Prime Minister said that the Akrams did not appear to have belonged to a terror cell, many terrorist attacks have been carried out in recent years by people who said they were inspired by Islamic State ideology. This past New Year's Day, a U.S. Army veteran with an ISIS flag in his pickup truck drove into crowds and then opened fire on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, killing 14 people. In August 2024, a Syrian man seeking asylum in Germany killed 3 people in a knife attack by the city of Solingen. Investigators said he had taken an oath to the Islamic State. The Islamic State traces its roots to al-Qaeda in Iraq and for years ruled large parts of Syria and Iraq, brutally enforcing its strict interpretation of Islamic law. The group suffered major defeats in 2017 and was greatly diminished. But remnants remain at large in the remote desert of eastern Syria, as well as online. President Trump on Saturday vowed to retaliate against the Islamic State after an attack in Syria killed 2 U.S. Army soldiers and a civilian U.S. interpreter. In a follow-up story from the New York Times, after an anti-Semitic atrocity, can Australia keep it together? Australia's Prime Minister blamed Islamic State ideology on Tuesday for motivating a father and son accused of killing at least 15 people at a Jewish holiday event in Sydney's Bondi Beach this week. Hours later, he made a hospital visit to Ahmad El Ahmad, a Syrian immigrant who has become a national hero for grabbing a gun from one of the gunmen before being shot in the shoulder. The 2 moments captured competing strains of Australia's struggle to understand the attack on Sunday, the deadliest act of violence on Australian soil since 1996, and what the recent massacre means for the nation's approach to immigration, anti-Semitism, gun control, and racism. The authorities identified the older suspect on Tuesday as Sajid Akram, an Indian national who moved to Australia in 1998 and was killed by the police responding to the shooting. His 24-year-old son was born in Australia, officials said. He was reportedly in a coma, and the authorities said 2 homemade Islamic State flags had been found in the car that they drove to the beach. The disclosures fueled concern about rising anti-Semitism in Australia, reflected in a string of graffiti and arson attacks over the past 18 months. In a diverse country that relentlessly debates immigration, many are now on edge about Islamist radicalization and a potential Islamophobic backlash. Flyers online are calling for a Middle Eastern bashing day at a beach south of Bondi where riots to reclaim the area occurred 20 years ago. At the same time, the actions of Mr. El Ahmed, 43, a Muslim shop owner who also immigrated in the late 1990s, offered a counterpoint. His mother in Australia, wearing a headscarf and speaking Arabic, told reporters she was proud to hear her son was helping people and saving lives. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called him a true Australian hero while standing outside St. George Hospital in front of an Australian flag lowered to half-staff. Again and again, these rival narratives clash. Villains versus heroes. Which will the country choose to make dominant? Australia, a country where "she'll be right" is a mantra of optimism and sometimes complacency, faces an enormous challenge to its cohesion. There are ominous episodes in its past, including a white Australia policy that barred non-white immigrants until the early 1970s. There are also examples of Australia's finding solutions in tough times. After a mass shooting in Port Arthur, Tasmania, killed 35 people in 1996, Australians threw almost universal support toward a gun law overhaul and buyback plan that pulled thousands of weapons off the streets and banned semi-automatic rifles. Even the 2014 Lindt Cafe terrorist attack, when an Iranian-born refugee held more than a dozen people hostage for 16 hours, killing 2 before being shot by the police, produced goodwill. Thousands of Australians posted their commute schedules on social media with the hashtag "I'll ride with you" to let Muslim riders know they had a safe companion on trains and buses. Many Australians now see a similar urge to keep rage from getting out of hand. I think the average Australian feels incredibly sad and really worried about the effect this has on not just victims, but society more broadly, said Jill Shepherd, an associate professor of politics at the Australian National University. What Australians want and will push for, she added, is what they know: stability. They don't love overreaction to things. They don't like shock, Ms. Shepherd said. They are used to stability because it's part of the country's institutional DNA. Democracy scholars have long argued that extremes stay at the fringe in Australia because of mandatory voting and a nonpartisan election commission that defines districts without gerrymandering. Politicians here have little incentive to fan the flames of emotion when turnout across the spectrum is guaranteed. The aftermath of this attack reflects that dynamic. Susan Ley, the leader of the Conservative Opposition Coalition, responded by offering the Prime Minister full and unconditional support. When another Conservative lawmaker, Andrew Hastie, said the Bondi massacre should spur a rethink of immigration policy, Ms. Ley instead suspended a previously planned rollout of a contentious proposal to lower the number of immigrants accepted. On Monday, she said gun reform must be on the table. On Tuesday, she announced a task force to press for stronger actions against anti-Semitism. Mr. Albanese maintains that his government has done a lot, banning Nazi symbols and toughening hate crime laws. But he also said it would do more to confront a documented escalation of anti-Semitism since Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. Last December, a synagogue in Melbourne was firebombed. In January, 2 synagogues in Sydney and a child care center were marked with hateful graffiti, including swastikas, while cars in Jewish areas and Jewish restaurants have also been set ablaze. After Australia accused Iran of orchestrating at least some of the attacks and expelled its diplomats, the 2 major political parties now find themselves in a race to approve recommendations from a July report by a special envoy on anti-Semitism, while praising emergency medical workers and heroes like Mr. El Ahmad. He's become the nation's favorite reprieve and source of hope. The fact that this was a Syrian guy, a Middle Eastern guy, who is a national hero, God, what a blessing, said Simon Chapman, Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University of Sydney, and the author of a popular book about the Port Arthur massacre and gun laws. As soon as I saw his nationality, I thought this is going to be so important for dampening down the racist debate. Managing the aftermath will still be difficult. Emotions flared instantly in Bondi, where videos showed an older white man stomping on the shooter's right after the police shot and brought them to the ground on the footbridge from which they had been firing. At the house where the police say the gunman lived in Bonnyrigg, a working-class area in Sydney's western outskirts, a bewildered delivery driver arrived on Tuesday with an offensive gift for a Muslim family, a half leg of ham. An attached message included a racial slur. Across the street, Glenn Nelson, a neighbor, blamed the attack on Australia's immigration policies, which he called too lenient. The government's got their own agenda. Keep bringing people in, he said. A short drive away, Ahmad Hussein, age 55, a halal butcher, said he felt frustrated by the language that had been used to describe the shooting. When a Muslim goes on a rampage or something, it's a terrorist, he said. When a person who is not a Muslim does something similar, he said, it's a gunman. Mr. Albanese seems aware of such tensions. In interviews, he has spoken more softly and slowly than usual, as if raising his voice just a little might incite violence. Jews worldwide have sharply criticized him for being too inert. In Sydney, too, frustration has often boiled over, sharpening grief with questions about what went wrong. Ben Wright was at the Hanukkah festival on Sunday, sponsored by Chabad of Bondi, where he is a congregant. He said he saw friends killed as he and his wife dived over their 3 children. In an interview on Tuesday, he said many in the community were still grappling not just with loss, but also with conflicting urges about what to do now. As an instinct, as someone who was at the event, you want to see radical change, he said. At the same time, he added, you know that's not the answer. He called on Australian leaders to start with greater transparency and by scrutinizing their failures as anti-Semitic violence had intensified before the attack. For example, the police acknowledged that the younger gunman had associations with Islamic extremists a few years ago. Officials offered little detail on why he had not been ruled a threat. They have also not explained how the government allowed the older suspect to have guns legally after his son was linked to an Islamic State terrorism cell. I feel like that should be public knowledge, said Mr. Wright, the festival attendee. What he did not want for Australia was the kind of closed border approach that President Trump put in place for several countries, mostly from Africa and the Middle East, after a refugee from Afghanistan was accused of killing 2 National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. last month. Just because you lock the border from a country doesn't mean you're locking out all terrorists, Mr. Wright said. It also doesn't mean that all people from a certain background are terrorists. 99.99% of all Muslims are good people. Despite fear, despite his own outrage over a massacre of Jews in a country where his grandparents fled after the Holocaust because it was as far could be, Mr. Wright said he and the Jews he knows do not want revenge. They just want moral and practical improvement and a return to Australian stability. The Torah tells us there are 7 things needed for all of humanity, and if you break them down, it's being a kind and just person, he said, and that's all we want. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times right here on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Just a reminder, you can always get your content, your favorite content, in podcast form. Just grab them in your favorite podcast carrier. The unemployment rate rose to a 4-year high in November, a warning sign for the health of a labor market strained by the Trump administration's cuts to the federal workforce and tariffs that have raised the cost of doing business. Data released by the federal government on Tuesday showed that the jobless rate last month rose to 4.6%, up from 4.4% in September. That was the last month that officials had a full picture of the labor force before the weeks-long government shutdown. It's the highest unemployment rate since September of 21, when the economy was emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, employers added 64,000 jobs in November, partly reversing a decline in October. a gain driven largely by the healthcare sector. But the federal government shed 168,000 jobs in October and November as workers hit by deferred resignations came off the payroll, according to the report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Wage growth also slowed to a level not seen since 2021, a measure that comes as more Americans express pessimism about the economy and concerns about affordability. Analysts and policymakers had hoped that the data released on Tuesday would help clarify the state of the economy after months of conflicting signals. For now, the signs are still mixed. The report exposed emerging imbalances that could tilt the labor market in either direction in the coming months, and analysts noted that the government shutdown may have complicated the data gathering behind this report, making it less reliable. The report is a disappointment overall, said Beth Ann Bovino, chief economist at U.S. Bank. The job market is weaker than we saw at the beginning of the year. Despite the silver lining of job gains in the private sector, Ms. Bovino said there were signs of stresses on households. The bottom line, I would say, is nobody feels safe. The data offered just a snapshot of the economy, and the view was complex. The data provided further evidence that the labor market has cooled significantly since earlier this year and is downright frozen for some groups. But so far, the slowdown appears to be a gradual deterioration, not the sudden decline that often accompanies a recession. I would ultimately take the glass-half-full perspective, said James Egelhoff, chief U.S. economist for BNP Paribas. Labor force participation is picking up, and the productive capacity of the economy is growing. The report did vindicate the Federal Reserve's decision to cut interest rates last week. Mr. Egelhoff said he expected the Fed to draw some comfort from the data, setting a course for a possible rate reduction in the first half of next year. The Fed, on guard for signs that the labor market is at risk of cracking, has delivered a series of quarter-point interest rate cuts since September, weighing the labor market's weaknesses against the risk posed by elevated inflation. The BLS is scheduled to release inflation data for November on Thursday. The White House sought to cast the jobs data in a bright light in a social media post Tuesday morning, noting the gains in private sector employment that it said benefited solely people born in the United States and the shrinking federal bureaucracy. But comparing workers born in the United States with those born abroad is difficult because of challenges in adjusting baseline population numbers. Although it's quite possible that the administration's immigration enforcement campaign could be depressing the foreign-born workforce, the report didn't demonstrate that conclusively. The report also shows a large jump in a broader measure of labor market slack, people who are working part-time who would rather be working full-time, as well as those who want a job but haven't looked in the past month. That share was 8.7% in November, up a full percentage point since this time last year. Such underemployment is a measure of underlying stress, said Diane Swank, the chief U.S. economist for KPMG, an accounting firm. This, along with a slowdown in wages, reveals the weaknesses that we're seeing in the labor market. The report also suggests the continuation of a trend in which people who have jobs are staying put and those who are looking for a job are having trouble finding one. You have pockets of labor shortages like in food processing, while the overall labor market cools, Ms. Swank said. The unemployment rate is especially grim for black workers. It's up to 8.3%, which is more than 2 percentage points higher than what it was at the beginning of the year. Black workers are often harbingers of what's to come in the labor market. They've been buffeted by federal policies over the past year, especially federal layoffs. Manufacturing shed 5,000 jobs in November, the seventh straight month of losses in the sector. So far, manufacturing has not appeared to benefit from President Trump's trade war, which he and his administration have argued will bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. The jobs report was late and a bit complicated because of the 43-day government shutdown that ended last month. The November jobs data was supposed to be released December 5th. The report included November data, but also the belatedly gathered October data. The publication of September's job data was delayed more than 6 weeks. The report showed a greater than expected increase in hiring, but with uneven gains centered on the healthcare and hospitality industries, along with a rise in unemployment. Tuesday's report also included revisions to data from previous months, depressing the picture for the late summer and fall with a combined fewer 33,000 jobs and bringing the number for August to a loss of 26,000 positions. The report puts more pressure on the Fed going into next year. Most officials at the central bank forecast that the unemployment rate will peak at 4.5% this year before gradually easing in 2026, according to projections released alongside last week's interest rate decision. Jerome H. Powell, the chair of the central bank, warned last week that technical distortions in the data suggested that it should be viewed with a skeptical eye, meaning that December's data, to be released in January, is likely to have more bearing on what the central bank does next with interest rates. Those numbers will also take into account the holiday season. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times here on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Chuck Stevens, your reader. In Philadelphia, beautiful blocks build community and safety. Environmental design interventions play a subtle role in helping the city reduce gun violence. Mary Felder knows the danger of violence in Philadelphia. She was once shot while cleaning up an alley in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood. Almost 2 years later in 2024, her 33-year-old son was fatally shot in another part of the city. She knows shootings have been down in Philadelphia the past couple of years, but she's gotten even more peace of mind from what's gone up: a new streetlight about 50 feet from her home. No single factor explains the sharp declines in gun violence Philadelphia has seen since 2022. Instead, many experts point to a range of interventions working in concert. One of those concepts is crime prevention through environmental design, the discipline of improving the appearance of neighborhoods to deter crime. In Philadelphia, environmental design interventions have included cleaning up vacant lots, installing warmer street lights, and developing community gardens. The City Council recently approved $277 million for a Housing Opportunities Made Easy program. The program has dedicated some $11 million for initiatives focused on blight reduction and neighborhood beautification. Fixing up a property's appearance prevents it from becoming a place to stash guns and drugs, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania Crime and Justice Policy Lab found. It also reinforces residents' sense of ownership over the space by making it look cared for. For a long time, this idea was conflated with broken windows policing, cracking down on minor property crimes with harsh punishments. Those zero-tolerance models enabled discriminatory practices such as stop and frisk and worsened mass incarceration. Still, the notion that enriching neighborhoods makes communities safer continues to ring true. Later research has reinforced that idea. Several studies by the University of Pennsylvania lab have pinpointed reductions in crime after a few interventions. When the Philadelphia Energy Authority swapped out old high-pressure sodium bulbs in streetlights for warmer LED ones that offered better coverage, nighttime gun violence fell by 21%. In areas where abandoned buildings were remediated, gun crimes decreased 39%. While the research showed sizable reductions in gun crimes after the interventions, many residents said a more immediate and tangible impact came from the bond neighbors formed. One local pastor in South Philadelphia heard from a community member that she would have to either spend more money to get to work safely or find a new job after being repeatedly accosted on ill-lit streets. The pastor Hendi Mathamushil of Indonesian Light Church enlisted fellow ministers from the community to help. Members of at least 4 congregations gathered for a prayer walk and documented streetlight outages. Their efforts eventually led the Philadelphia Energy Authority to enhance the city's streetlight network in crime spots. Mr. Mathamuel said the real power of the streetlight project was in bringing together Black Baptists, Indonesian Mennonites, and white non-denominational Christians. The best thing in safety is you know your neighbors, he said. We are living in our silos, but this kind of collaboration creates a bridge and it opens doors. Beautifying the block, according to locals, creates a pathway for residents to connect and learn about what's happening in the neighborhood. John Solomon, a Strawberry Mansion native, leads a group of violence interrupters who bring residents planters with solar lights. The nonprofit Philly Safe provides the pots, and delivery drops double as safety patrols. Drivers speeding by honk in recognition. Residents on stoops wave them down, asking how to get a planter. Those interactions, Mr. Solomon said, have an invisible yet meaningful impact. You have people coming up to us, getting involved in the thing that we do in our community, and providing us intel on shootings that happened, he said. West Herald Street stands out among neighboring streets for its warm environment. On one block, friendly chatter echoes from one porch to another. Thick green stems pop against brick row homes. Twinkling bistro lights line the corridor at night. As John Williams, the homeowner, sprayed a hardy leaf with water, he said the small fixtures did more than make the block pretty. They also got retirees out of their homes and helped keep crime away. It's a close-knit block, so you cannot do anything without it being seen, he said. We look out for one another. Before the street lights were upgraded, the area around Ms. Felder's home had experienced several shootings annually. After new lights were installed, the numbers fell. There were 0 shootings in her vicinity in 2024, and only 1 so far this year. Other parts of Philadelphia that introduced street-level interventions saw similar results. On a map of 57 most shooting-afflicted blocks in Philly, Kensington, a neighborhood that has experienced higher rates of violence, homelessness, and drug use than the rest of the city, has been flooded with targeted interventions. In the midst of it is a community farm on Hart Lane. Before goats and chickens bobbed around the grass, the land was abandoned. Jessica Schaffner, who lives next door, said the lots the farm replaced were a hotspot for drugs, sex work, and violence. After community members banded together to build the garden, Ms. Schaffner said the violence on the block seemed to wane. It can be easy to feel scared where I live, she said. Building community makes me feel better. Researchers call that feeling social infrastructure. Enhancing public spaces draws people out of their homes, putting more eyes on streets and creating conditions for community members to develop meaningful relationships, said Eric Klinenberg, a professor of sociology at New York University. Over time, neighbors develop camaraderie, those deeper connections, and the sheer presence of people outside, Mr. Klinenberg said, help deter crime. Since the Hart Lane neighborhood farm's opening, the block has experienced less violence. But less than 200 feet away, homicides and shootings continue to plague a street corner notorious for drug-related violence. As that example shows, environmental interventions are not a panacea. They are a modest part of many citywide efforts to prevent violence. To Bill McKinney, the executive director of a nonprofit that has built several gardens in Kensington, enhancing the environment is a useful cosmetic intervention. But eliminating gun violence, he said, requires addressing more systemic issues of poverty, trauma, and more. There is very little reduction of violence as a result of environmental changes, Mr. McKinney said. It's like, hey, we solved it on this block, and all that means is 1 block away, everybody's dying. In Kensington, gun violence considerably decreased during the last decade, but the neighborhood saw a temporary resurgence in 2024. That year, city officials cleared out an encampment for homeless people a few blocks north of Hart Lane, and federal authorities broke up a large firearms trafficking ring operating a few blocks west of the area. Mr. McKinney believes those events pushed much of the activity toward the garden. Researchers acknowledge that some crime might be displaced by the interventions. Their studies controlled for the possibility and found that it was rare. In many instances, adjacent streets also experienced slight declines in crime. In the Nicetown neighborhood, a decline in violence helped kickstart an environmental improvement. Shootings there have declined over the past 5 years, from a high of 25 fatal shootings in 2021 to 4 so far in 2025. As that unfolded, Ariel Presley helped enact a tree planting program. What started with one seedling in front of her home has grown into a line of trees running down her street. Children now ring her doorbell asking if she has any flowers they can pot. People she rarely saw outside of their homes sought out our seedlings. You get to know your neighborhood. You get to see another human being, not being afraid, but actually seeing them, looking them in their eye and having those human interactions, she said. Maybe you'll think twice before pulling the trigger. Because you are from the same block, you're from the same community. More from the New York Times here in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's jump over to the cooking section because it's the holidays, and the best holiday party is a dessert party. I can't argue with that. For centuries, sugar flowed into cakes and pastries only on rare occasions, and the holidays were the season for elaborate bûcher de Noël, panettone, and gingerbread houses. In this age of daily little treats, it's harder to capture the same awe that must have accompanied once-a-year confections. But this dessert table absolutely does. It evokes the abundance of Renaissance still life paintings with updates taken on European classics and modern creations inspired by flavors from across the globe. What makes these showstoppers especially satisfying is how anyone can make them. I don't think I could, but anyway, the cookbook authors Nicola Lamb and Yassi Arifi have been baking professionally for decades and turning their pastry chef wonders into recipes straightforward enough for novice bakers. They've delved into the stories of cherished desserts and carried them along their evolution with brilliant new flavors and formats. Meant for slicing and sharing, these big rounds can all be assembled for one spectacular dessert table. Or you can prepare whichever ones you want and add your own sweets to the spread. Setting them on gilded platters, vintage or modern, and at different heights with the help of cake stands or stacks of books or blocks will create a dramatic table for any gathering. Well, there's a great place to begin with tiramisu pie. Dressing up a classic dessert is a great way to get it ready for a party. Here, rich tiramisu-flavored cream and classic coffee-soaked ladyfingers are layered into a dark, crisp Oreo crust and covered with chocolate curls. Tiramisu has achieved legendary status in the dessert canon despite being a relatively recent invention. Its exact origins remain disputed, but after emerging in Italy in the 1970s, its popularity has consistently grown. Perhaps surprisingly, the tradition of cream pies in the United States predates it by a century. It is only right that the two should finally meet. Then there's Dubai chocolate cake. In 2022, Sarah Hamouda created a chocolate bar to quash a pregnancy craving, even though she had never made chocolate confections before. In her home in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, she tinkered with pistachios, cream, and a shredded variety of phyllo known as katafi, eventually creating her signature Can't Get Kanaf of It bar. A year later, an influencer called it Dubai chocolate in a TikTok video that went viral, and the rest is history. Now, countless variations have spread around the world. In this recipe, Yosa Arifi tops a tender chocolate cake with a creamy, crunchy pistachio katafi layer. To give it the glimmer it deserves, she cloaks the two-tone stack with a silky chocolate ganache and adorns it with a crackling necklace of nuts and more katafi. And the picture doesn't even do it justice. It looks amazing. Next up, apple pie has a French cousin, and its name is pastis gascon, hailing from Gascony in southwestern France. It doesn't have a definitive genesis, but most likely dates back to the Middle Ages. Also known as croustade aux pommes or tourette pastis gascon, is the meeting of several divine things: apples, Aromagnac, and phyllo. This meeting is facilitated, of course, by butter and lots of it. The result is a crispy crown of pastry filled with soft, yielding, aromatic scented apples. Golden Delicious are popular in classic French recipes, but using any flavorful variety that holds its shape well when cooking will work. Next up, the creamy yuzu and raspberry tart. Over the past century, there's been a mutual admiration and influence between Japanese and French cuisines, with a shared reverence for training chefs in the craft of fine dining. That's especially evident in pastry and the exchange of ingredients across the globe. Yuzu, a floral citrus fruit popular in Japan, has found its way into buttery tarts, like this update on a classic lemon tart. Yosa Arifi has incorporated its distinct aromatic juice into a velvety, creamy curd set in a tender crust. Fresh yuzu remains difficult to find, but bottled juice delivers its signature complexity. All right, the giant Mont Blanc. A classic dessert, the Mont Blanc was named for its resemblance to the tallest mountain in Western Europe. Since its first appearance in 19th century France, it's undergone various transformations. In its simplest form, sweetened chestnut puree piped into noodles meets the mountain of whipped cream. The now famous addition of meringue was popularized by the Parisian tea room Angelina, whose version helped cement the dessert's modern identity. A crisp meringue base covered in whipped cream and chestnut strands. Here, the Mont Blanc is piled in maximalist fashion. Layers of cream and meringue are stacked high and cascaded with chestnut puree. A secret layer of chocolate and coffee cremeux is nestled within the meringue foundation, adding a grounding base note. Well, let's stay with food, shall we? Here's a restaurant that has an answer to our fast casual fatigue. Food trends come and go, but it seems like nothing can topple the corporate bowl. A form infinitely replicated, its interchangeable parts mostly decontextualized, its contents varying only slightly. Stay at your desk, let the chilled, undressed lettuces and room temperature piles of rice arrive, each optimized to assist you with your own optimization. The bowl is not just a vessel, but a template, a strategy, and intricate economy. As the year comes to an end, several chains that specialize in bowls have reported a surprising dip in sales, and you might wonder if this signals the end of our collective love affair. But I don't know, was it ever really love? Faced with a pricey, poorly assembled, anonymous squelch of carbs and fiber and protein, the most I might feel is relief, as if my appetite were an inconvenience in need of a fast and frictionless solution. But it's not, which is why I avoid a lunch bowl if I can help it. At least I did until I found myself at Choppin' Block in Houston, where I feasted on rice folded with dark greens under a heap of sweet, crumpled, almost caramelized plantains and skewers of thinly sliced beef suet, browned but tender, still blushing inside, dusted with a magnificent and revitalizing yaja. For inspiration, opiamusu, look to the kind of chain restaurants that were built to scale, where flavors are often subdued to appeal to the broadest possible audience, focus group to death. But the delight of Choppin' Block is in its sure sense of self, its lively, multi-dimensional cooking, and clear, delicious vision for modern food from the black diaspora. Mr. Amasu opened his first location of Choppin' Block in 2021, a sliver of a stall inside a Houston food court with a short menu of bowls he called block pairings. Each was a substantial meal that pulled together Mr. Amasu's takes on Western African curries and rice dishes, grilled meats, fried plantains, and vegetables. Last year, he expanded with a nearby spot in the Montrose neighborhood with a bar, dining room, and patio that could seat about 100, and a longer menu that pushed his culinary ethos further, expanding on ideas laid out by so many American sit-down chains. Mr. Amasu had expected diners to walk to the register at the back of Choppin' Block's dining room, order and pay, then sit down. The problem, his new space with its soft booths and African textiles, was quite beautiful and inviting. People wanted to sit down right away to hold menus to get comfortable. They wanted more time with each other and with the satiny frozen drinks that slushed out of the machines at the bar. Every restaurant changes, adapts, grows into itself, but Mr. Amasu had to quickly rethink his operation and switch to table service. Choppin' Block can be slightly chaotic now, particularly at dinner time when the room gets packed and people come in looking for the host stand. Staff shout and wave from wherever they are, drawing diners to the back counter, directing them to tables, and a whirlwind of servers, warm, informal, and quick with the jokes, run the orders with their handheld devices. The food comes out as it's ready. On my most recent visit, a Nigerian red stew made with a base of peppers and onions, blessed short ribs with the smoky fluorescence of palm oil, along with rice and beans. There were sweet, chewy plantains in the bowl to temper the glowing heat of Scotch bonnets. But there's a freewheeling style in many of these generous compositions, synthesizing flavors from across the black diaspora. Yassa, a Senegalese curry you might have over rice or couscous, arrives as a deep pool of lush sauce, with a levee of peppery Nigerian-styled shrimp and an earthy bank of waka, the Ghanaian rice and beans stained purple from sorghum leaves. The motherland, an easygoing coconut curry, held the same comfort as Kenyan kukupaka. When I had it topped with chicken edges blackened by a blowtorch, Liberian greens, here a mix of collards with kale, are finely chopped, cooked until very silky, then presented as a dip for long, crinkly tongues of plantain chips. It's utterly simple, but draws you in for more with the mouth-watering twang of not too much MSG. An international shortcut to building umama that tends to be used carefully and layered with other forms. Born in London and raised in Houston, a hub for West African immigrants since the 1980s, Mr. Amosu was working as a sales executive in oil and gas when he started to imagine his own modern West African restaurant. Nothing fancy, but the kind of place he'd want to stop in for lunch when he was on the road. He didn't have any prior experience as a chef, but Mr. Amosu worked nights at Chipotle as a prep cook and dishwasher and studied with aunties in Houston and beyond, taking notes as he worked alongside the best home cooks and caterers in his network. His cousin taught him how to make rich jollof, which he smokes in the pot and then finishes with turkey sausage. It's not unusual to look around the dining room and see someone dancing in their seat after taking their first bite, wiggling around, snapping their fingers. How good to be reminded a bowl can be filled with everything, even joy. More from the New York Times here on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an appraisal. Rob Reiner made clear what he believed in on screen and off. In films like A Few Good Men, the director's ideas of honor and morality were stated as plainly as it could be. In the last scene of Rob Reiner's 1992 courtroom drama, A Few Good Men, two Marines, Dawson and Downey, have just been cleared of murder and conspiracy charges. They admitted involvement in the death of their fellow soldier, Willie, who died in a violent extrajudicial punishment that they say they conducted at the behest of their commanding officer. Despite that acquittal, they've been convicted of conduct unbecoming a Marine and will be dishonorably discharged. Gobsmacked, Downey protests that their colonel has just admitted that he ordered them to do it. What did we do wrong? We did nothing wrong, he says. Yeah, we did, says Dawson, with solemn and shame in his eyes. We were supposed to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. We were supposed to fight for Willie. He's right, of course, and this recognition is bigger than any dishonorable discharge. You don't need to wear a patch on your arms to have honor, the lawyer reminds Dawson as he leaves. It is one of those thesis-stating moments that crops up in old-fashioned courtroom dramas, where the lesson of what we've watched is stated plainly, just in case we missed it. That can be handled clumsily, and Aaron Sorkin, who wrote the screenplay for A Few Good Men, has turned out a few clunkers in his time. But in this movie it lands perfectly. It feels sincere and unforced. There's little doubt in my mind that Reiner, who died with his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, on Sunday, is the reason. As director, he makes the moment land, and he was known to work closely with writers on script revisions as well. But perhaps more importantly, the moment seems to encapsulate something key to who Reiner was, his lifelong drive to work for the causes that he believed in. Speaking to the New York Times ahead of the film's release in 1992, Reiner said the story presented the same moral dilemma the Nazis dealt with at Nuremberg or Calais at Maillet. And it wasn't just about military chains of command either. We're all subordinate to somebody else, but we all have to make decisions about what's right and what's wrong. From the beginning of his career, Reiner was associated with those thorny moral and ethical questions. He became a household name playing Michael Stivic, a.k.a. Meathead, the left-leaning son-in-law of Norman Lear's sitcom All in the Family. The character's altercations with his bigoted father-in-law, Archie Bunker, unpacked contemporary social issues and the generational divide, not always along simple black and white lines. When he moved into directing films, Reiner proved himself versatile, able to pull off genre-defining mockumentary, This Is Spinal Tap, coming-of-age drama, Stand By Me, fantasy adventure, The Princess Bride, romantic comedy, The Sure Thing, and the legendary When Harry Met Sally, and psychological horror thriller Misery with equal aplomb. In 1987, he co-founded the independent production company Castle Rock Entertainment, which aimed to give filmmakers extraordinary creative freedom. Whether their work earned or lost money, the results were remarkable. Among them, Reiner's own films, as well as The Shawshank Redemption, Before Sunrise, Michael Clayton, and even TV shows including Seinfeld. As celebrated and successful as Reiner was as an artist, he also was an unusually effective activist. Unlike some in Hollywood who simply speak out on social media or wear a lapel pin for a cause, he invested time, resources, and his own reputation in causes and built a track record of results. All of this activism on topics like same-sex marriage or the environment made him a regular punching bag, both from conservatives and on South Park, where he was portrayed as a corpulent hypocrite. Rob Reiner was just a great target, the show's co-creator Matt Stone said in an interview in 2006. But he seemed undeterred, and some of his politics explicitly surfaced in his art. His 2017 drama Shock and Awe follows a group of Knight Rider journalists investigating the rationale behind the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq. A recent documentary that he produced, God and Country, explored the emergence of Christian nationalism in the United States and its ties to far-right politics. Yet, it's really in movies like A Few Good Men that you can see his notion of what makes for real goodness shine through. Not getting everything perfect or fixing the world, but more simply standing up to powerful people who hurt the weak. Idealistic? Sure. But the same sentiment crops up again in another Reiner-Sorkin collaboration, The American President, which directly influenced Sorkin's TV show The West Wing. In movies like A Few Good Men and The American President, even in fantasy like The Princess Bride, Reiner's sense of justice comes through clearly, standing up for the little guy, whether it benefits you or not, is the most noble thing you can do. That legacy of activism and standing up for others was mentioned often by friends and colleagues, paying tribute to Reiner after news of his death. In an industry where it can feel increasingly rare to see talk matched by walk, Reiner stood out. You don't need to wear a patch on your arm to have honor, after all. And finally, let's turn to some movies. Some of the best movies by genre of 2025. In the science fiction category, Danny Boyle's 28 Years Later smartly refreshed the zombie genre by depicting a future in which Britain, overrun by a horrific virus and cordoned off from the rest of the world, has regressed into a pre-industrial society. You can see this latest installment in the series as a bonkers, stylistically brilliant Brexit allegory, but it also doubles as the story of a boy, played by Alfie Williams, coming of age in a very dangerous world. The scary movie that hit me the hardest this year, with punches of terror, joy, sorrow, and remorse, was Good Boy, Ben Leonberg's harrowing supernatural thriller, starring his own dog, a Nova Scotia duck tolling retriever named Indy. Story is typical horror stuff. A man, played by Shane Jensen, facing personal demons, holes up with his dog at a rural cabin that's haunted by an evil apparition. Another from the horror genre that slapped the writer across the face was Weapons, Zach Krieger's maximalist genre-hopping tour de force about missing children, communal trauma, and a dastardly witch named Gladys, played by Amy Madigan, who many horror fans hope will turn this week's Golden Globe nomination into a win. And the film that ripped my heart out was Bleeding, Andrew Bell's brutal, raw, and superbly acted addiction drama turned vampire thriller, set in a dystopian America where blood is a drug. It's as devastating as it is empathetic. My favorite horror movie recipe. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 17th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chuck Stevens. Thank you for listening.